Most of you probably did, because the Patriots won. All right? Do you have faith or what? And not only that, the coach has achieved a milestone, 300 wins. Other than that, it's a great way to start the week here in Providence at the New England Council. And I want to begin by thanking our friends at Amica, who are unable to be here today, but they've been very generous in sponsoring the program. And it's been a very, very busy fall for the New England Council. And we have a full calendar in the weeks ahead. Needless to say, later this week on Thursday, October 26th, in Boston at the Omni Hotel, we will be gathering with some 1,800 of our nearest and dearest friends and supporters of the New England Council, which is extraordinary. We've said it all along that we may not be the biggest organization in New England, but there are very few business organizations that could gather 1,800 New Englanders to celebrate 4 extraordinary New Englanders of the year. And we look forward to seeing many of you this week. I know that many of you in this room are already sponsors of the event, but Larry is here from our office, and he's available if you're interested in one additional table. He'd be more than happy to help you. In November, we look forward to events here in New England. We represent the newly elected representative from Vermont, Becca Balin, and also Representative Seth Moulton. It will be hosted in Boston. In November, we'll also be hosting a breakfast in Washington with Representative Bill Keating. As always, you can find more information and register for any of these programs on our website, newenglandcouncil.com. But today we're honored to welcome back a great friend of the New England Council, needless to say, a tremendous advocate, not just for this wonderful state, but for the entire New England region, and I might add for our country, and that is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. As all of you know, he is serving his 3rd term representing the Ocean State, after previously serving as the state's Attorney General and as the United States Attorney for the District of Rhode Island. Needless to say, many of you know that he's been a champion on Capitol Hill on a wide array of critical issues for our region, from promoting the development of offshore wind and other renewable energy resources to combating the opioid epidemic to making vital investments in infrastructure. He currently serves as the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee and is a senior member of the Environment and Public Works Committee, where he has been one of the United States Congress's most outspoken advocates for combating climate change and protecting our oceans. As the number 2 Democrat on the Judiciary Committee, he has worked tirelessly to combat corruption and to fight for transparency and accountability in our courts. And as if all that isn't enough to keep him busy, also sits on the Senate Finance Committee. So we're truly honored that he could take the time to join us today to update us on his work in Washington on this incredibly unique and challenging times in our nation's history. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to the Honorable United States Senator Sheldon Whitehouse.
Here we go. That one off, this one on. That way I can move around a little bit. Good morning. Thank you all for having me back. I'm grateful to be here. I think there's going to be a little bit of time for Q&A, so rather than try to give a full overview of everything that's going on, which would take some time, I think what I'll do with my intro is focus on one particular issue, and that's sea level rise and climate change. For those of you who have not gone there yet, I commend a visit to the Storm Tools website that Coastal Resources Management Council runs. Rhode Island CRMC has been one of the best agencies in the country at predicting and plotting sea level rise, and they can take it right down to individual buildings now and run multiple scenarios on those buildings. So it's really interesting and a little bit alarming to go and see, but it's very high quality information. And President Armstrong and I came up from Newport this morning, and there may be a lot of people who think, well, that's like those coastal communities. Actually, the two hardest hit ones are probably going to be Warwick and Barrington. just because they're low and flat and a little bit of sea level rise goes a very, very, very long way. So because I've seen those maps and worked on this issue, and my wife is a marine scientist and helps educate me in all of this, I've been working very hard in that space. And on climate, there's some good news and there's some bad news, and I will start with the good news. Because the House is in such a state of complete discombobulation, I'm not looking at new legislation right now. I'm looking at what we can get the Biden administration to do on its own. And my focus has been on, first of all, carbon pricing. And as you know, many of America's biggest companies have an internal carbon price, so that as they're making investment decisions and choosing where to do and what to spend on, they bake in a price related to carbon emissions pollution. And we have one coming up through the federal government, through EPA. It's going to be $190 per ton, so it's a real one. And I have persisted in banging on the Office of Management Budget to make sure that when that comes live in EPA, they give instruction to the rest of government to adapt and follow it themselves everywhere you go. So permitting, pricing of things, purchasing, licensing, all executive branch government endeavors will be guided by the $190 price per ton. It sends a really big price signal into markets and helps guide regulation and so forth. So that's a win, and that should actually come live probably in about a month when the Administrative Procedures Act process for the EPA rule that has the carbon price baked into it concludes. So score one. Then methane is obviously a worse pollutant for climate than carbon dioxide. Shorter lived, but really powerful. So, and now satellites can pick it up. And a satellite can track a methane leak to like the size of a tennis court. So in the same way that if we were in Providence and the fire department saw smoke billowing out of a window, they would rush apparatus to that building to stop it. When the satellites see methane billowing out of a leak, I've asked the Biden administration to set up a methane enforcement task force to go and hit it as fast and hard as possible by pulling permits, filing cease and desist orders, dropping lawsuits, bringing criminal charges, whatever is most appropriate to rapidly put an end to the leak. If we do a good job at that, we can then take that internationally and say, hey, look what we've done. All countries should do the same thing, and we can get after some of the big methane leakers around the world. But to quote my friend Eddie Markey from Massachusetts, it's hard to preach temperance from a bar stool. So we have to get our own methane leak house in order first, and they are on that. Department of Justice is running it, and I'm pushing on that. Another thing that's coming up, and this will be of interest to Rhode Island businesses, is that the European Union is putting a tariff on imports to the EU. So if you export to the EU, you're going to be looking forward to tariffs if there's a differential between the carbon intensity of your product and the carbon intensity of manufacture in the EU. And they run the numbers first for a couple of years, starting next year, and then they actually put a bill on it, and you're paying euros, a real-life tariff. And my fight right now with the Biden administration is to get them to be positive about that, lean into it, join it if possible, and try to make sure that the system is in place to minimize U.S.-paid tariffs. Even if we do nothing, this is where it gets interesting, even if we do nothing, the tariff on China is so much bigger that the experts who advise the EU on this anticipate that it will drive supply chains into the EU from China and to the U.S. in cement, in steel, in pharmaceuticals, in chemicals, in aluminum. So there's going to be, I think, a fairly significant economic disruption, and I think a fairly positive one, as this all goes live, and I'm urging the Biden administration to get with it rather than fight back against it. They've had a pretty major hiccup on offshore wind, so we're trying to I only warned them 7 times, so, good job listening, guys. But they're now really focused on trying to make sure offshore wind comes back to life because it has a lot of problems. And then I think John Podesta is working very hard in the White House to implement the IRA. So if we implement the IRA well, if we get offshore wind back on track the way it's supposed to be, if we join the EU in a proper carbon border tariff, if we have a robust executive branch-wide social cost of carbon, and if we're whacking the methane leaks and setting an example for the rest of the world, suddenly a pathway to climate safety begins to emerge. And we can do all those things even with the House in its current state. So that's the good news. Here's the bad news. I came into politics with Governor Sondland, and what we got opening day was the meltdown of what was called RISDIC, which was a state deposit insurer that blew up. And later during that year, every workers' compensation insurance carrier said, we're leaving the state, we're out, we're done, all at once. So I have this like early experience, and I still twitch a bit from it, of how bad insurance failures can be. Now, a few years back, Freddie Mac, the mortgage giant, warned of a property values crash along the coasts. Not because the water was washing into the house, but because the risk of water washing into the house was now so clear that you couldn't get insurance. And if you can't get insurance on your house, you can't get a mortgage. And if you can't get a mortgage, the only people you can sell to are people who are cash buyers. Hence, the property values crash. And Freddie Mac said it's going to be as bad as 2008. And those of you who are here, the credit union people here, remember what 2009 and 2010 were like? It was a nightmare. We do not want to go back there. But that was the warning. That was the warning. If you look at Florida, you are seeing it begin to come true. And my antennae from the workers' comp and RISDIC meltdowns are vibrating. 12 insurance companies have gone bust in Florida. The rest of the insurance industry is either stopping writing new policies or pulling out of the state. The state's efforts to fix that are things like tie auto and home insurance together so you can't write one without the other. Now all you've done is move the problem into the auto insurance market. And the reason our workers' comp carriers all left at once was because they feared an assessment for the inadequate rates compared to claims that is the way the system made up the difference. Well, guess what Florida has done? They have set up a RISDIC, like a state insurance carrier, and everybody's fleeing to it. And it has $4 billion in it. It's called Citizens Property Insurance. It has $4 billion in assets. Idalia just ran up so far, a $10 billion bill. And that was a fairly minor storm. Ian is north of $110 billion in damage. So the insurance market exits. Everybody in Florida flees to Citizens Property. It has effectively no reserves against claims of the magnitude Florida has already experienced and can be predicted to experience again. And when those big claims come, the solution is an assessment on other carriers and on other insurance policies. Well, if you do the math, let's go back to Ian, 110, let's say it was 104 billion, just for numbers' sake. So 4 billion wipes out Citizens Property. Now it's got a $100 billion liability to contend with, and it needs to raise that by assessing other Florida insurance policies. Ultimately, that comes down to Floridians. There are 22 million of them. So that's about $5,000 per head. So take out the children. Take out the seniors living on Social Security. People who have no way that they're going to pay the $5,000. Now it's like half of that. Now you're at $10,000 a head. And as people say, I won't pay $10,000, the number shrinks of people who can pay, and the number per person explodes, and you get into a death spiral where there's never a moment in which there is a number that there are enough people to pay that they're willing to pay. So that is the scenario that Freddie Mac predicted, and it has begun in Florida. And Freddie Mac predicted that it would go national, that it would be a systemic risk that would be so pronounced in the economy that we'd feel it up here in the same way that in 2008, even if you didn't have a bad mortgage, you sure as hell felt what went wrong there. So my whole spidey sense of insurance disaster is tingling, and I'm preparing to have hearings and to continue to look into this more. But if you or your friends have property in Florida, you might want to take a real close look at whether now might be the time to sell before the thing heads down the drain. As you know, insurance crises signal that they're coming, but when they come, RISDIC was overnight and workers' comp was all in the same, everything left in the same year. So that would be bad. And that's another reason why I keep fighting this climate problem, because long before, polar bears and pteropods and actual water flooding happens, there are these very dangerous, catastrophic risks to the economy. And if you don't like just coastal property, go look around where wildfires burn. It's the exact same principle. You can't insure because you don't know what the wildfire risk is, and so you can't get a mortgage, and on you go. So that's the big mess I'm trying to head off right now. It's a little late in the game to head it off, but I think companies who are looking at this and business enterprises who are looking at this and people who own property in Florida who are looking at this need to think through what this might mean in the months and years ahead. So on that happy note, we can talk about whatever else you want. Should we talk about something else fun, like the House of Representatives? And the quest for Speaker? Where is it going to be?
I don't think you're going to be invited to the Realtors Association of Florida's Legislator of the Year.
No, not in Florida, but I gave this presentation to the Rhode Island Realtors about 10 days ago.
If I could just, I know time is limited, but a couple of people asked me to ask a couple of questions also, so maybe we just ask the first one. The President has already submitted his military, or about to submit his military aid package, $105 billion, but it's a combined package, $61 billion for Ukraine, $14 billion for Israel. There's some money in there for Taiwan, and there's some money in there for the border. There are people in the Senate who are saying, I like it. I don't know if I like it as a package. I'd like to see it voted on independently. And your thoughts on whether this is going to pass the Senate, and will it be one vote, or will it be broken up?
I think it will pass the Senate as a package. The leader is in agreement with that, Chuck Schumer. The minority leader, Mitch McConnell, is in agreement with that. And anybody who knows politics knows that you got to put your stuff together to get it done. It's even more acute here because in order to do a funding measure, there's this weird rule called the blue slip, which is that the measure has to start in the House under the Constitution. So what we have to do when we're starting stuff in the Senate is find a bill that started over in the House, strip every single word out of it, and then use it as the vehicle to fill in our bill and send it back, and now it meets the constitutional requirement. But there are only so many of those. So you don't want to chop something up and have to use 3 or 4. We have very few, and we need to save them. We need them for the big appropriations measure, and we need them for this. Yeah. And then the House is going to be a very weird situation here, because they may have to do something like, as we close in on the next government shutdown,
November 17th,
and they've got to deal with presumably a CR, maybe our appropriations measures, one or the other, and the supplemental for Israel, Ukraine, etc. They may have to have like Queen for a day and vote to make either McHenry, the acting speaker, the speaker. He said he doesn't want it. I can't understand why not. But he might take it for a week, during which week, in the same vote, they tee up the passage of this, get out of the mess of a government shutdown and move on, and then they can go back to quarreling with each other again. I mean, very strange things are possible, but having multiple bills just makes all of that more difficult when dealing with them. They are basically allowing us to jam them, and we should say yes to that invitation.
And the House seems to have peaked in the support for Ukraine.
Hard to
How about
tell.
the Senate?
Hard to tell. Senate is very solid still.
Okay. Now, we have no ambassador for Israel. We have no ambassador for Egypt. And yet, all the turmoil that's occurring there. When will the Senate take up those two appointees?
Well, Jack Lew, who is the Israel appointee, has already had his hearing on a rushed basis, and I suspect we'll probably try to clear him this week and get him on a plane there. But even if we get those special, sort of high interest ones done, it still leaves us with a problem that one Republican senator has blocked all of the military promotions, which makes it really difficult to move people around and take over positions. In fact, our most recent head of the Naval War College is supposed to be a senior leader in NATO command, and she can't land there because it's not approved yet. So she's out of Naval War College, and she's not in at NATO yet. So that's just one of like 400 and some examples. We got a different Republican senator who's stopping all of the Department of Justice employees. Now, there aren't so many of them, but that's a blockade. And then we've got another one who's blocking ambassadors. So at some point, what we need to do is have a full-on, across-the-board fix of all of this. There's a rule that allows us to do that, but it's the so-called nuclear option. And it's called the nuclear option because the side against whom it's deployed feels that they've had a nuke dropped on them. So we need to either get a quiet understanding that we can do this without triggering huge, massive partisan blowback, or better yet, even see if there may be 8 or 10 Republican senators who would vote for that nuclear option to clear all these positions so that it's clear this is not an act of partisan hostility. This is an effort to clear a national problem. But Chuck has to deal with the balance of at what point do you make all the appropriators walk away from the bipartisan appropriations bills, or get them so mad that we can't get the Ukraine and Israel money through. So that's the balance, and I think as pressure builds, that tipping point is getting nearer and nearer.
You made the statement recently, we must recognize Israel's right to defend itself from murderous terrorists. Would you be in support of Israel invading the Gaza area?
I'm not going to second guess what Israel's military thinks is the best way to go about making sure that Hamas cannot pull another brutal measure like that again. But I think the president has been very persistent and very prescient about warning them that if you go into a heavily densely populated zone like that with all sorts of children and civilians around, the likelihood of things going wrong is very big. And so you need to be really careful and really smart and have really thought through your plan before you go and do things that you'll later come to regret. I think the president has handled this particular episode extremely, extremely well. And so, I hope that Netanyahu is listening, and that the Israeli military is listening, and that they are as prudent as they can be while discharging the obligation to have to their people to get rid of this murderous organization. It's like ISIS by the sea.
You've gotten an awful lot of notoriety for your legislation, term limits for Supreme Court justice, an 18-year term. Under your legislation, I think a new justice would take the bench every 2 years. And,
Correct.
And after 18 years on the Supreme Court, they would be limited to hearing, I think, small number of constitutionally required cases. You also filed a formal complaint with the Chief Justice Roberts last month in response to Justice Alito's public comments on your Supreme Court ethics bill. Tell us why you did this and how successful you think you'll be on your legislation.
So the Supreme Court is in real disgrace right now, and it's very self-inflicted. I was talking to a bunch of doctors just in the last few days, and the doctors were irate about what was happening at the Supreme Court. They said, we can't take a ballpoint pen from a pharmaceutical company or somebody who's trying to sell us services. And here are these guys taking $40,000, $50,000, $100,000 vacations from billionaires who are funding organizations whose purpose is to influence the court. That's just unacceptable. So we have to fight our way through this in kind of a weird political doom loop because the Supreme Court is now so political and partisan. The Republican Party is now wrapped around defending it as a political and partisan organization. And so I'm chipping away at different ways to try to get through that. And I've had 2 successes so far, and there are several works in progress, and the Supreme Court ethics bill and the term limits bill I would consider still works in progress. But I think we only probably know 10 to 15% of what's gone wrong at the Supreme Court. And I think that as we continue to investigate and it becomes more and more clear how bad it got, there comes a point where even Republicans have to say, all right, I'm throwing in the towel. We got to fix this mess. This is just too gross. And public pressure has a lot to do with that, which is why I'm talking about it a lot publicly, because the public pressure will drive the Republicans to accept changes that will restore and redeem our Supreme Court. And as somebody who's argued in that Supreme Court, I feel very strongly that it should be a court again and not just the outpost of a black-robed outpost of a bunch of right-wing billionaires.
It was reported in the New York Times this past week that our federal budget deficit effectively doubled in the 2023 fiscal year. And there's various reasons for that, and whether it's slumping tax revenues or rising interest rates. But I think what the point that I'm trying to make is this year it had increased to $659 billion, and last year was $475 billion. Is Congress, is this a defining moment that people in Congress are going to say, we can't keep doing this because eventually what we pay in the debt will be more than what we spend on defense or other the discretionary funds? So,
I hope so. I have been working for several years now to try to reform the way the Budget Committee operates so that we can use the Budget Committee to help solve this problem. At the moment, the Budget Committee can't solve this problem in any meaningful way because the only thing that we are authorized to look at is appropriated spending. And the real money is in healthcare spending and in tax spending, all these multi-trillion dollar giveaways that have gone to big corporations and the super wealthy. So you have to be able to look, this is just arithmetic. At the end of the day, you've got to look at all the numbers that add up to your deficit, and the Budget Committee is now constrained from doing that, which is crazy. The other thing that the Budget Committee has is no goal. And pretty much everybody in this business agrees that your target needs to be a debt to GDP ratio. You can argue what the debt to GDP ratio should be, but that's the metric that you would measure it. So you need to lock that in. And then you can't do it overnight without turning the economy head over heels. So you've got to set up a runway from now to the debt to GDP ratio. And if you do that with alarm bells along the way to let Americans know whether they're on course or not, you have a rational discussion about what the debt to GDP ratio should be rather than idiotic discussions about balanced budgets, which make no sense at all in the context of the federal budget. And you have a rational discussion about how long it should take to get there and whether you're on course. And you're looking at all the numbers, including the really big ones, healthcare and tax spending. And if you do that, then I think you begin to have at least the tools to measure anticipate, predict, and deal with the problem. And with that, I'm getting signals that I need to go. When the Iranians ran a truck full of explosives into the Marine barracks in Beirut, Rhode Island had the highest ratio of casualties. And every year there's a recognition for the families of those Marines who were killed in Middletown at the historical society. And every year I go, and I've been working with their lawyer to try to make sure that they get access to Iranian accounts so that they can seize buildings and things that Iranians own around the world, so that those funds can then come back to the U.S. and help redeem their losses and the losses of all of the other Marines killed in that horrible incident. So I hope you'll forgive me for cutting out on you to go there, but this is kind of a semi-personal thing to me. And the lawyer who I worked with on this is also suddenly been stricken very ill, and so I want to say something in his name too, because he did really amazing work. It was us against the Department of Justice and the State Department to win these things, because they don't like private citizens meddling in their foreign affairs. But when it comes to Rhode Islanders who have the ability to get judgments and then execute on those judgments against the murderous Iranian regime, we took them on and we won.
We want to thank the Senator, but also this past week, the Senator celebrated a significant day. It was his birthday on, I believe, October 20th. So I just want to wish him a belated happy birthday. Thank you. All right, Senator, thank you.